استخیش مغروری زمانه است که هر کس با خود گرفتار است عالم گرفتاری خوشتا سلسله.
Yeah, so this is episode 3 of the Endurance series, the speaker series that we started. And Margaret is going to be talking about endurance in Afghanistan and what does that really mean, among other things. So basically, she'll give us the overview of history and the current state and maybe some possible futures, and we'll have a nice discussion about it. As I've said, we'll be recording the event, but it's okay for you to leave your video on because I'll use the spotlight feature in Zoom so that you aren't recorded. And that way Margaret can actually see people that she's talking to. If you guys hear any of the restrooms, you all know where they are. Okay. You all know where your restrooms are at home, I hope. And if you want to send any questions in, you can use the chat feature in Zoom. We may also open up the mics and let you ask it in person. I don't think we have that many people. Sometimes that can be unruly, but I think it would be okay. And then there's also the New Yorker article. I have it here on the table. It's the September 13th issue of the New Yorker, an excellent article that Margaret suggested folks could read. And I can put the link to that in the chat window here in just a minute. I'll do a quick plug for programs. You may or may not know we have Tech Tuesday, every Tuesday at noon from Orcus Online. They're very generous with their time. We have Drop-In Chess now Sundays, first and third Sundays. We have Game Night now on Sundays. And then Jean McPherson's doing a conflict management workshop next week. We have 8 spaces getting close to being full. And then for this series, we have Peter and Ginger Neiman speaking toward the end of the month. They circumnavigated the globe in their sailboat, Irene, and it was quite challenging during COVID. And then Carl Kruger will join us December 2nd and talk a bit about endurance and vulnerability. You know, he's done some really long and plans to do longer trips, and there's a lot of vulnerability involved there. I can't speak. So, but today I'm delighted that Margaret's able to join us from Crane Island, the ancestral home. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but they've had a family home there since the 70s. And Margaret graduated from Mercer Island High School in '64 and then Radcliffe College and Harvard in '68. After that, she went to Iran for archaeological field work. I'm going to mute everybody just because it's exactly.
Yeah, maybe this can all be condensed.
Hold on, I think I have to stop sharing and then I can mute everybody. Admit all, mute all. There we go. Yes, there we go. All right, so I think that's better. Oh, better. And there we are. Thanks for your patience. And I think there's someone else I need to admit. Nope, everybody's in. Good. Alrighty, so here we are with Margaret again. While she was there doing archaeological field work, she also began teaching English language in high school in Tehran, and teaching in an English language high school in Tehran. And then spring vacation came, and she went to Herat in Western Afghanistan in peaceful revolutionary times, and she was motivated to switch her field of study to folklore and cultural anthropology of Afghanistan. As she said to me before we started, she likes the live people better than the dead people. I think more interesting. And then she returned to Herat and Kabul in '74 to '76 for field research for her PhD dissertation on oral narrative, Harvard in '78. Her recordings are actually in the Library of Congress, which is pretty cool. I'd love to go listen to them if you can send the link sometime, Margaret. And then her research continued, focusing on folktales and oral history over the decades with 2 families. And she made repeated visits as political circumstances permitted, first to Afghan refugees from the Soviet War in Peshawar, Pakistan in the '80s, and then back to Herat and Kabul. Her most recent visit to Herat and Kabul was in 2019. And she has published numerous books and articles. This is a summary of her book publications, which is also available to you if you'd like. And for today's discussion, she has known and lived in Afghanistan in peacetime, and it sets her apart from more than 70% of the Afghan population. It's staggering to think about that number, isn't it? And about 50 of them half are now under the age of 25.
The thing up there, match your screen.
Yeah, it's for some reason it has. Let's see what's the matter. Why isn't it? Okay. Oh, I know. Hold on. Come on. Oh, here we are. Resume. There we go. Thanks for your patience out there in the hinterlands. So these are her books, and today she's going to talk about some of the long view. And, what does that mean? Sorry. What does a long view tell us about Afghan resilience and change? Now, urgently, what are we to think of possible futures? And this will be, after her short introduction to Afghanistan's past and futures, a launch point for Q&A and our own observations. So I think I'm gonna stop this slideshow now, and I'm gonna spotlight and ask Margaret to unmute, and I'll spotlight her, and she's spotlit, and then you should be able to speak. Go ahead, Margaret.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't want to make this too dry. It's kind of a lot, I guess. Just looking at the word endurance caused me to think a bit, because endurance involves strategies. How are you going to get through or past difficulties? And the stakes of endurance actually differ from, different people. So the Taliban stakes in Afghanistan, for instance, and their endurance, which we've now seen, are different from, say, that of other military and paramilitary groups or non-combatants. And so everybody's got a stake in endurance, but what it is that they're trying to keep and hold and continue as their center really varies. I said I would do history, the current state, and possible futures. I'm going to romp through a bunch of this stuff. We can always go back to some of it or just forget it. So the peacetime experience, I think it's really important that a lot of people there have not had a peacetime experience. And that really matters, say, in the coherence of neighborhoods, the degree of trust that exists between families and people. And this is a big deal for Afghanistan, for Afghans in particular, knowing your neighbors and having your neighbors be virtual family members in a lot of cases. It really, displacement and warfare and factional and violent factionalism has done really pretty awful things to the state of Afghan cultural expectations. Not that it was, a beautiful land of peace before, but it was an awful lot more peaceful and people were working together in different ways. So there's a present demographic that has half the population doesn't remember peacetime, and even more, and in addition to the ones that were born there in the last 20 years, there's also the displaced and returned demographic. And there was always labor migration. It was there in the 70s. A lot of guys were going abroad to earn money because the Afghan, well, for instance, a day's wage in Tehran on a building construction project could pay you exactly 10 times what a day's labor could pay in the adjacent town of Herat, which was over the border. So there was a lot of male labor migration, which meant actually that women had more to do with running their family and running their household. It was an interesting dynamic. That was until the war started in 1978, at which point it wasn't labor migration, it was refugee flight. And at the height of the refugee displacement in the Soviet time, in the Soviet war period, 4.5 million Afghans, it was the largest displacement that we know about in recent history. Now there's been some huge ones, other huge ones, but 3 million were in Pakistan, another 1.5 million were in Iran as displaced, SDPs. A lot of them returned in the 1990s when they could, bringing the refugee experience, which for some of them included more access to health and more access to education than they'd had in their home villages before they left. And that was both in Iran and in Pakistan. So what, how do we talk about endurance and change? What does it mean to endure? This is kind of unanswerable questions, but they're on my mind. And it goes to another big question that might or might not have occurred to us, and that's who's an Afghan? Who decides if you're Afghan or not? And there's quite an internal debate about who is Afghan and who isn't. So people who stayed on through all this have a greater kind of authenticity, credibility load than those who left as refugees and came back, despite the fact that there's an idea, the idea of refugeedom is alive and well in Islam, because the Prophet himself and his followers had to move from Mecca to Medina, and moving in order to protect your religion is a legitimate thing to do. So refugeedom, when the Soviets were taking over the country, had some authenticity, but going to a non-Muslim country like the United States or Europe was problematical. So refugees who returned after the departure of the Soviet, and even more after 9/11, were treated with some credibility gap by those who stayed on. So the identity, are you really an Afghan? Or are you just a carpetbagger who's back here to benefit? This was especially obvious after 9/11. And there's identity politics that you may have heard something about. The nationalism of Afghans is a very complicated process. There's 4 major ethnic groups and a bunch of others. The Pashtuns, who dominate in the south, Tajiks, who are Persian speakers, who are different groups of Tajiks in the west and also in the northeast. Turkic populations, Uzbek, Turkoman, they're both Turkic language speakers, are in the north adjacent to the Central Asian republics of Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. And the Hazaras, who are in the middle, who are Shia, religious minority. There's other small Shia populations, but they're the largest religious minority in Afghanistan. Most are Sunnis. And the Taliban have come down very heavily on the Hazara, treating them as non-Muslims. So there were basically pogroms. There's a history also that most Afghans will claim of repelling invasion, and it's a source of national pride. There were 3 different Afghan-British wars, 2 of them in the 19th century, one that ended that in 1920 in a kind of an well, that's complicated, so let's don't talk about that. But those were primarily Pashtun populations up against the British of British India. And then, of course, there's the Soviet War, which was 1979 to 1989. And all ethnicities had anti-Soviet because anti-Muslim participation. When the Soviets pulled out in 1989, there was a civil war that went from 1989 to 1995 or 96, during which the various military groups fought each other and vied for what didn't work out to be a viable power sharing arrangement for national government. And of course, the Taliban turned up in 1996, give or take, and were welcomed in some places because the alternative regimes were warlords, basically, as we called them, commandants, as the Afghans called them, who were extractive and it just wasn't a viable situation. The Taliban did bring a certain kind of stability to the population, but as we know, it went sour for most of the population, certainly most of the urban population. I think a lot of the rural population was not much affected. The Taliban didn't pay much attention to them, and most of the customary law and cultural practices in the rural areas were not something the Taliban felt they had to reform. So there was, and this goes on, and that you'll find in the New York article that Anand Gopal wrote, a very vivid description of how the rural women see latest occupation, how totally disastrous it was and why. And he names names and dates, and it's a brilliant, brilliant analysis of the situation in the South among Pashtun women in non-urban settings. And it's one of the best things I read at that short space. There's also great books written by Steve Poll, P-O-L-L, whom you may know. He's also a New Yorker guy, but many other things. And he's written a couple of excellent books on Afghanistan as well. But Gopal had amazing access to traditional women or traditionally minded women, and makes us much better aware of what they see and how they understand the situation now, and how it unfolded for them during this period of since 9/11, the anti-Taliban, supposedly anti-Taliban activities in Afghanistan. So the US NATO occupation was it is felt as an occupation from 2001 to 2021, as we know. The Taliban being primarily, but not solely, Pashtun ethnically. And there were diverse stakeholders in making the US NATO occupation work there. It's worth mentioning, and I just threw this in at this point, I could have mentioned it at the outset, that the borders are actually the creation of 19th century geopolitics, that what glues Afghanistan together still as a nation is shaky, I would say. And partly it's like it was compacted like a brick or something by the British and the Russians facing off in Central Asia. The Russians working to take over, and then the Soviet Russians taking over Central Asia, which they did up to what is now the northern border of Afghanistan, and the Brits taking over India, and that included what is now Pakistan, up to the border, the southeastern border with Afghanistan, which was actually formed in 1890 and was only supposed to be for 100 years. It's supposed to be a temporary treaty, what's called the Durand Line. So that border has always been right down the middle of Pashtun territory, and always very porous. And Pakistan feels it has major stake in Afghanistan's political future, and has been a major player in all the goings on since the Soviet invasion in 1979. Just to touch on the economy, the 20th century, when I was there, it was basically subsistence agriculture. Cotton was a cash crop that was managed by the central government for export. Opium was there, but not as the kind of heroin producing area that it is now. And now, one of the other things, besides this creation of basically a narco culture, is also extractive hopes and possibilities led by China, because they have large deposits of iron, copper, and various rare metals that we all have in our cell phones. So there's lack of infrastructure. It's going to be very hard to get this stuff out physically, but the Chinese are quite interested in doing that. However, the current economy, as we know, is crashed because 75% of the cash flowing around Afghanistan was the war economy. It was our money in the military and international money in humanitarian intervention. That all came to a screeching halt on about August 20th, when Taliban got control of Kabul. So the result is an economy that is down in flames right now, and people are beginning to really starve. The UN is saying something like a third of Afghan kids are already in significant to severe malnutrition, and they're gonna lose some people if something doesn't. The other point being climate change, that they were in a semi-arid, high altitude kind of climate with periodic drought. Not all of it was high altitude, I should say. The northern part is actually Central Asian plains, which is lower, but they would have periodic droughts. Maybe every 20 years or so they'd have a drought. Now they're longer and more frequent. So 2019 was a dry year. I think 2020 was just a little better, but now they're back in drought phase with failed crops and wells in people's houses drying out in the city, and just evil stuff. I don't know if you've heard the term rentier state, R-E-N-T-I-E-R, rentier. The idea of a state that is only sustained by so-called rent, which is paid by external interests and forces, and that would have been us for the last 20 years, and Soviets before that. Soviets didn't throw as much cash into Afghanistan, but essentially they were. And the British were actually paying subsidies in the 19th and 20th century to try to keep the Pashtuns sweet. So this idea that there's an external source of money to run the Afghan state has been around, but the kind of money that we threw in was unprecedented in its corrupting capacity. They've also got difficult neighbors, as you probably can tell from looking at the map. It's Iran, Pakistan, and the post-Soviet Central Asia, all of whose republics and the Soviet Union, the ex-Soviet Union as well, Russia, are very concerned about Islamic resurgence and Islamic separatism in that area. And then, of course, there's China, which has, if you've probably heard the term Belt and Road, they have this amazing development initiative, which is going basically from China to Africa and wherever else they think there's stuff they want, building physical access, making loans to countries to build their infrastructure. These are loans for which the lessee ends up supposedly having to pay back, but also paying China. It's sort of like us, actually, that except it's their money on loan. It's Chinese workers, Chinese specialization, Chinese development, design, and so on, under what's essentially a different kind of rentier system, but it means that countries getting infrastructure courtesy of China are also going to be owing China quite a bit. So what this does to the extractive possibilities remains to be seen. Not that we're any less sinister, but nonetheless, what we did in the cash economy of Afghanistan is extremely harmful and ended up with a lot of fat accounts in the Gulf and in Swiss banks, and not a whole lot of infrastructure development in Afghanistan. Chinese may do better in that respect. So, throwing all that at you, I was thinking, so what is Chinese culture, or what is Afghan culture after 40 years of war and displacement? And, but to add in 20 years plus, because the communist regimes were also very interested in urban education. And when I went back after not being able to go there for 18 years, because first the Soviets and then the Civil War, so I was there in 78, and then I couldn't get back until 94, basically, to see my friends and foster relations in Herat. And that time, I was told that during the Soviet period, the teachers' college, which was the higher education institution in Herat, was totally full of women, because the guys were either drafted. Oh, excuse me, I should have bagged that. And I don't know. Just a minute, I'll can it. I'll forget it. Whatever that is, it's a junk call. Anyway, so I came back in 95 to discover to learn that there was a cadre of teaching of women trained as teachers, because the teachers' college was fully enrolled by women, probably the majority, 60 or 70% were women, the men being either in the army or on the lam, so they wouldn't get drafted or fighting in the resistance. So I've met a bunch of women who were, quite interested in going on with professional lives, even in the 90s. Then, of course, came the Taliban, so they were all home and or teaching clandestine schools to kids in their homes. And then after 2001, there was and this was urban, we're talking about the urban population, and I refer to Gopal for you to get the picture in the rural areas. But after the Taliban took a hike in 2001, there was a mass interest in education for social and economic mobility, both women and men. And so one thing that did happen in these 20 years is in the urban areas, a whole lot of people got educated to an extent that they hoped would give them earning power, viability, mobility, economic mobility. And the other thing that happened was mobility, that there has been now, especially a mass exodus of people whose training allowed them to participate in the war economy as military adjuncts, translators, but more than that, also logistics, doing, product, moving stuff around to bases and doing a bunch of work that armies need to have done. And then also humanitarian activities. And there was a strong Afghan women's professional movement, you could say, in more obvious in Kabul, but there were professional women elsewhere that we were able to interview occasionally. I wish I had a more systematic approach to that, but at any rate, there was high expectation of education being opening some doors, either if not for the individuals themselves, then for their children. And that's 20 years out. We'll see what happens next with that. But some people are saying, I think a little bit optimistically, that education is something you can't steal. I think the Taliban have demonstrated that education is something you can't use unless they let you, which leads to depression, high suicide rates, if the last Taliban period is anything to go by, among women, that women were incarcerated to an extent that it really, damaged them psychologically. I'm talking about urban women. The rural situation is different. But I thought, if you want to babble on, I could give you the history, since I'm doing oral history of these two families, one of which was she's the grandmother now, her husband is deceased, the grandmother and grandfather. She was the subject of my dissertation because she was a master storyteller, and she was willing to tell me anything she knew about folktales, and also invite friends of hers to tell folktales, which she would then learn, because one of the things I was trying to figure out was how people organize oral knowledge, and story repertoire was one way to look at that. So anyway, so we were buddies in 1974 to 76, and I've stayed in touch with her and her family. She's still there, but she's very frail, and her husband has passed. He was actually a Peace Corps cook. And at first I wasn't interested in meeting her because I thought, I don't need the Peace Corps. Peace Corps, for one thing, they speak a funny dialect of Persian, which they learned to speak for Americans who have 2 years in country. And it's there to be complimented on doing it, but it's not the kind of Persian that you want to do if you're studying linguistic anthropology. Anyway, but it turned out she was a master storyteller, and she also was not hanging out with foreigners because she was in pretty strict purdah because she'd had some demonic possession experiences and was trying to keep the demons from bothering her anymore. That's part of the story. Anyway, so she's still there. And the story I wanted to tell you is of her oldest grandson, who is now in bad need of getting out of Afghanistan. And I should briefly state that I'm working with him and his little family of wife and 2 kids, and also the family of my research assistant. He himself is still with us, and his wife, and 3 of his 6 daughters, all of whom need to get out also for security reasons. So these are people who didn't get evacuated in August, and they're among the 50 or so thousand, perhaps more, who would qualify for evacuation and may need it. It depends how efficient the Taliban are in taking what they see as control, which also sometimes constitutes revenge or incarceration. I should say, before I tell you Ahmed Saeed's story, and he's a boy, he's a guy, I should say that one of the repeated decree moves on the part of the Taliban, I've seen now 3 different decrees, all of which are versions of the same thing, saying that all women over the age of 18 or 20, depending which decree, need to be married, period, need to be, as they say, given to husbands. And if the family fails to do that, the Taliban will oblige by marrying them off to Mujahideen veterans, that is, Taliban military veterans. And one of the decrees, which is for the Northeast, for Badakhshan, this is a local mullah who apparently can speak with a Taliban seal on his decrees, that women who are widowed, if they are still widowed, if they're not remarried, if they're widowed in the war, in the Taliban war, then they would also be given to Mujahideen veterans. Any woman under 35 or under 47 in a different decree. So the Taliban seem to have somewhat focused on compulsory marriage for women, which of course has a disastrous effect on their self-determination in labor or education. Part of one of the decrees, the one that I think is the 18-year-old one, is that before women can resume their education, either at the university or at high school, they must be married and they must be accompanied by their mahram, who is their legal male guardian. If you can imagine your husband taking you to school every day, that's going to work out great. So these things, I mean, they seem kind of comical, but they're really not. They're a form of extreme oppression, and I'm looking at 3 of them from different parts of the country, all of them promulgated since the Taliban took over. So somebody probably is serious about doing this, and certainly my friends, the 3 unmarried daughters of my research assistant, are taking this very seriously. So I'll just say that. But I don't know, do you want to hear Ahmed Saeed's story? I think it's interesting. It's a guy's story, but he's somebody I've known. Basically, I knew his family before he was born. Am I talking too much? Who wants to? Everybody's muted, so I can't say. Where's the boss? Hey, Carol?
Yeah, I'm right here. I chatted yes because yes, we want to hear your story.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Your sound doesn't carry unless you get near the mic.
Everyone would like to hear the story.
Okay. I thought I was going to stop talking by now because I'm in half an hour, but all right, quickly, I'll do it. So Ahmed Saeed is the first oldest grandson of my friend Mado Zahir, who's the storyteller. She had maybe 1 year of education. Her husband, not a whole lot more, but he managed to get himself a job as a Peace Corps cook and proceeded that way and got his kids educated to a great extent. Ahmed Saeed's father, Zahir, got the most education. He got a couple of years at the local teachers' college, but then realized that income was going to take him in some different directions. But he married his cousin, and it was this is Ahmed Saeed's father, married his cousin. It was a problematical marriage, financially speaking, because the family's, his grandma, my storytelling friend, wanted them to marry up and wanted to marry Zahir, the father, into a better family, upper, more wealthier family, basically, more prestigious family. But her husband, who's very conservative, wanted to marry close, got Zahir engaged to his cousin's daughter. They got married, they had a little kid, Ahmed Saeed, whose story I'm telling. And then they were by this time refugees in Mashhad in Iran, and she was trying to light a kerosene or fill a kerosene heater's fuel without turning it off, and she burned herself and ultimately died of the burns. So he was a half orphan while still a nursing infant. He was probably a year old, maybe a little more, loses his mother. And his grandmother, my storytelling friend, is nursing his youngest cousin, who's about his same age. So she also wet nursed her grandson. And this was all in Iran, in Mashhad. The father remarried in order to have somebody to raise this baby. However, she turned out to be a wicked stepmother who proceeded to get 9 of her own kids and really wanted to marginalize Ahmed Saeed. One of Ahmed Saeed's first communications to me was in halting English, which he was learning in school, telling me the story of the wicked stepmother, which as a folklorist was pretty familiar territory for me, but not funny. His grandparents helped to raise him. His father, however, loved him, I think, as well as his other kids, and used severance pay that he got from an NGO where he'd been working to buy Ahmed Saeed his first computer. And this was in the 90s. And Ahmed Saeed said, "Oh, great, I'm gonna have an email cafe, which you could have with one computer in those days." And he was a high school grad, very bright, self-educated, as it turned out, in computer systems design, and specifically in management and logistics, moving materials around, with logistic data, with people moving the stuff around, but keeping track of it all on your computer. And he got a series of jobs. The first one was in developing a TV channel that was opening up in Kabul, basically, but he moved from there. into military logistics, so that he was managing the contracts to deliver military fuel and other supplies to bases all around Afghanistan. And the list is long, and he's kept the list. However, this was all from his hometown of Herat. He and the director of this logistics company were both directly threatened with death. And the company owner fled to Belgium. Ahmed Saeed went to Kabul and continued to work for another subcontractor, still in military logistics, for a couple of years. So he has enough years in that to qualify for a special visa to the United States. He then got a new job in international trade, civilian trade, and it was also logistics. But he was being hunted and traced in Kabul, he thought, and he has reason to believe that. In the process of the last couple of years, he got certified as at risk. In American terms, it's called a special immigrant visa. It's the one they give to translators. His was almost done. The thing that he lacked was the sign off on by the chief of mission in the Kabul American embassy, and the last interview, which I'm sure that when that embassy closed, the chief of mission had a stack of these guys' files on his desk, and they weren't processed, probably were destroyed. But that doesn't matter because it's all online, because our hero is good at that. Anyway, so there they were in Kabul with what he feels is the active interest of the Taliban on his case. His debate is whether to identify himself, because there's such a thing as a letter of remittal that the Taliban will sign off saying so-and-so identified himself as doing the following work, turned in his gun, which Ahmed Saeed doesn't actually have one of, and therefore we will not bother him. The force of these remittal letters is unclear. The one that Ahmed Saeed just sent me was from a friend of his, an acquaintance of his, who got the remittal letter. I have a copy of it, and its translation as well. He, on the basis of that letter, decided it was time to go be a refugee in Iran, and he got out of Dodge, and he's now in Iran as a refugee, which is not a place from which you can go easily to Europe, or certainly not to the United States. So Ahmed Saeed, in sending me this, is trying to let me know that remittal is not a solution. It does not remove your risk. At least it's not perceived as doing so. He's back in Herat, his hometown. He's trying to keep low. The most recent email, among other things, he told me he's applied for a job in humanitarian logistics with an NGO, with an international NGO that is, trying to get food and health care and so on distributed. And he's very well versed in distribution management, and he can't get a job. They've turned him down because he's worked for the military. So he's got a target on his back, and the mark of Cain on his forehead because he worked for the military when we were there. He's still at risk. He needs evacuation with his wife and 2 kids, and that's one of the things I'm working on now, because there's such a thing as humanitarian parole, which, if you get it, means you can come to the United States for a set period and work on a visa as a special immigrant visa or as an asylum as appropriate. But there are probably, I don't know, tens of thousands of people now trying to get humanitarian parole because of our failed evacuation process. So that's Ahmed Saeed's story unfolding, and I need to get that file off to wherever it's going to sit for the next 2 or 3 months before somebody reads it, while he tries to stay safe. And multiply that by tens of thousands, and you've got Afghanistan's urban population at this point, the ones that were involved directly with the war economy and with humanitarian. The other family, the 3 girls in my research assistant's family, they're at risk because the older of these 3 sisters actually worked with State Department funding in a humanitarian capacity with women at risk. She was the fiscal review officer for an organization that was helping women incarcerated, women in safe houses, basically women on the lam from abuse and so on. And that also puts her on the Taliban's hit list, along with her sisters and her mother and father. So I'm trying to get those people out as well. And she's not so clearly a military target, which probably means it's going to be harder, but she and her 2 sisters are also subject to these compulsory marital decrees, and their parents are in no position to protect them. They're elderly and not well. So that's you know, the latest chapter in the oral history of these two families, if you want. I think I could stop there. I could also tell you an Afghan joke, and maybe I should,
Yeah.
because you need a joke at this point. It's pretty dark, but it's a joke, and it predates all this, and I think probably still Afghans would swear by it. The story is that there's these animals, and they all live in a river delta on what's called a jazirah, which is basically an island. It's part of a river delta with river on both sides, you know, like a delta. And but the food is kind of short in the delta where they're living, in the delta land where they are. So they decide they want a bridge to go over to the next jazirah. And the obvious thing to do is to get the government to, you know, build them a bridge. So they have a jirga, they have a gathering of all the animals, and they decide to send their most impressive animal, and that's the lion. So they send the lion off to Kabul, and in the story, in the version I heard, it is Kabul. They send the lion off to Kabul, and he goes off, and he doesn't come back, and he doesn't come back, and he doesn't come back. And after 2 or 3 months, he finally comes back, and he's all ragged and worn, and his fur is all tattered and everything. And they say, "What happened to you?" He said, "Oh my God, you know, I got to Kabul, and they sent me. I go to one office, they'd send me to another office, and then another office, and eventually, I knew they were just sending me around in circles. So eventually, I gave up and came home." They said, "Okay," and the animals still don't have enough to eat, so they're looking at one another. And the fox says, "Well, listen, I'm supposed to be the clever one. I'll go." So the fox goes off to Kabul. And he also doesn't turn up for months on end, and finally comes back all bedraggled. Same story. So you couldn't believe these people. They just lie, you know, they just do these things. And I couldn't get anywhere. And so they're all commiserating about what are they going to do. And alongside, in the back of the gathering, walking along, sort of minding his own business, comes the donkey. And the donkey says, "Well, hi guys, what's up?" And he didn't even know that all this was going on. You know, he says, "Oh, shut up, you stupid donkey. Don't bother us. We got business here." And he said, "No, I mean it. You're my friends. Tell me what it is." So they told him the story. And he said, "Well, I'll go. I'll take it. I'll take a turn." They say, "Yeah, sure, go. What the hell? Do it." So the donkey goes off to Kabul. And again, total silence, no communication for months and months, like 3 months or something longer. And then one day they look out, coming over the plain, there's this immense cloud of dust. And in the front of it is this little donkey walking, right? In front of this big cloud. And so he finally gets close and they see that, it's their donkey. And they say, "What do you, what happened to you? How come you were gone so long?" And he said, "Well, it was kind of awkward. I mean, I got there and I started oh, for Christ's sake, I'm sorry, I should have shut this down. I'll call you back. I can't talk right now. Anyway, so he said, "Yeah, well, I went there, and the thing is, it was kind of time consuming because, they're all my relatives, and each and every one of them invited me to dinner, and I couldn't insult anybody, and I had to go to each person's house, and they said, 'Well, okay, fine, so you're back, and what's all this?' Because they look in this dust cloud, and then there's this immense line of construction materials and machines and equipment just stretching off, behind the donkey. And they said, 'What's all this? This is a huge amount of stuff. This is way more than we needed for one bridge.' And the donkey said, 'Well, we talked about it, and I talked to all the experts there, and we couldn't decide whether you want the bridge across the river or up and down the river.'" I have to say, I told that same story to a gang of Republicans who were fundraising for Ohio State University, and they loved it. So you have to consider your audience, but it does speak directly to the Afghan feeling about central government that's of long standing, and so far nothing has persuaded them too much to a different, except they now think that the corruption has reached rather higher levels. And I think I can speak pretty consistently about that because we did a set of interviews in 2019 when was it? I'm trying to remember. It was 2012 when the war had been on for like 10 years, 11 years. And I decided to ask just 2 questions. One, what needs to happen in Afghanistan and what can happen in Afghanistan. And the answers had a lot to do with corruption. They had a lot to do with the destruction of social, excuse me, social trust and I'm sorry, and networking and the things that, that held the society together. And this was 10 years before it all fell apart last August, as we thought, but it was falling apart the whole time. So that joke, I think, has to do with a feeling, that the central government is not there for us in any way, shape, or form, unless it happens that they're your personal relatives. And that has to do with the fact that all politics at that point starts with families and kinship, and ultimately perceived kinship and ethnicity. So, and it means personal connection is what makes things happen, good or bad. So I think those things are still largely part of Afghans' expectations.
Shall we open it up for questions, Margaret?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
If I can stop sneezing, that'll be helpful.
Oh, well, maybe we can give you a little break here while we're.
No, that's okay. Let me see. I may have some tea. Let's see if I drink all my tea. No.
So I'd say go ahead and take yourself off mute if you'd like, pardon me, to ask a question. You can also put it in the chat. I'll monitor that, or you could raise your hand in Zoom. Either way, I see you've come off. All right, Phil, go.
Margaret, what is it about Afghanistan? You hear the saying where empires go to die. I mean, Soviet Union, United States, now China with, I guess China's probably the smarter strategy. They're not trying to do a military thing, but is it resources? Is it geographical location? What is it? Why countries keep going there as empires? Let's put it that way.
I think, yeah, I think you could say that the wars we've seen, both the British contra the Russians and the Russians against, what they saw to be a Muslim uprising that was going to compromise their Central Asian control, and are going in after the Taliban. It all has to do with geopolitics and with the fact that this is kind of a knot of intersecting strategic, I mean, not rich ever really, unless the Chinese are right, but a knot of intersecting geopolitical interests and concerns. And I'm only talking about the last 2 centuries, which is, a relatively short period for the area. But I think, it's more about strategic interests and terrain that's virtually impossible to defend. It just, it's I'm saying it's geopolitics. It's certainly the Afghan people who live there have been in various ways able to resist occupation. But I think occupation was sort of at the very end of the imperial lines of control. Certainly that was true of the British and Soviet, or Russian and Soviet face-off. And I think it was true of us too, that, even with our thriving military industrial complex, that was the end of a long supply line and very expensive. And I think rightly negatively viewed as an expense matter. What shoulda, coulda, woulda, what would we have done about the Taliban? Al-Qaeda's role in Afghanistan was by conscious design to try to perpetrate exactly what they got, which was a geopolitical confrontation that would eventually, in their minds and in the minds of ISIS, which is a different geopolitical Islamic, what can I say, imperialist effort, which is interesting because the Afghans don't want ISIS there at all. ISIS is now an adversary of the Taliban. The Taliban are, as Islamic as they are, they're also highly nationalistic. And it's not clear, what their stake was in Al-Qaeda. I think we overestimated I mean, they certainly were not going to kick bin Laden out, and bin Laden and Al Qaeda were certainly, as they are elsewhere, interested in creating the political and military circumstances for a wider confrontation with us, for instance. So how much of this is Afghans doing Afghan stuff, and how much of it is geography and longstanding political rivalries? I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's a question that sounds simple and really isn't. And a lot of people sort of say, well, the Afghans are just ungovernable. They're a bunch of rabble rousers. Well, what I see in Afghanistan is a very tenuous gluing together of interest groups by one dominant, by the Pashtuns, who for various reasons, size, and also not this go around and during the Soviet war period, not trivially logistically backed by Pakistan in a big way. And Pakistan wanted Afghanistan there as an Islamic backyard, basically. And they are still deep in sustaining the Taliban. They may be, I don't know what they're doing financially, because they themselves are not in great financial shape at this point, but they certainly have a stake in the Taliban's resurgence and its continuation in Afghanistan. How the Chinese are playing the Taliban is another really interesting question, because they, as you probably know, have their own issues in Xinjiang with the Uyghur Muslim minority, whom they have basically incarcerated in concentration camps and are re-educating. It's basically a genocide situation there, and how they can then make common cause with Taliban, with other polities in Central Asia that are at least nominally predominantly Muslim, is really interesting. And I'm not enough of a geopolitician to understand how they pull it off. But it's, I think, suffice to say that just being a Muslim is not helping the Uyghurs vis-a-vis Taliban or Central Asia in general.
And just a brief follow-up then, China, I read somewhere that they have a lot of mineral leases and things like that. So they must think that there are some resources there that they can use for the Belt and Road Initiative.
Oh yeah, that's their whole interest in Afghanistan. They don't want Islamic revolution leaking over into Xinjiang, but no, they're there for the goods, as they are elsewhere. And they're not playing ideology. They managed to avoid playing the ideological card, which is very interesting too, because I mean, one moment of the interviewing that we did in 2011, I should remember exactly, but anyway, we were talking to this guy. I was with the director, the Afghan director of our Afghanistan Studies Center in Kabul, which is a consortium of universities. And Omar is a really smart guy. He finished his MA and PhD in anthropology in the States, and he's now actually in Minnesota trying to do some things there and continuation of that institution. But anyway, Omar and I were doing these interviews, and we talked to this guy in Mazar-i-Sharif in the north, which is a relatively progressive city. It's the one that's adjacent to the Soviet Central Republic, the Soviet Central Asian republics, now not Soviet, obviously, but who have benefited in infrastructure and education very much by their association with the Soviet Union. Anyway, so Mazar is basically Uzbek and Hazara population, which meant that it was in the gun sights of the Taliban. And this guy that we talked to had managed to be, I think he was running a radio station by the time we met him, but he'd been a civil society activist for a long time. And we were talking about the American occupation. This was 10 years in. And he said, well, I think Afghans are just sick of this. He said, we've had too many isms. And first we had communism, which meant forget God. And now we've got capitalism, which means forget God and worship money. This is not something that, that Afghans understand or respect. and, you know, civil society oriented Afghans. There are plenty of Afghans who are making a lot of money off capitalism at that point, particularly wartime capitalism. But he was, you know, he was saying it's ideology as we've experienced it has done us no good. And he was saying democracy, he was saying the problem with the idea of democracy is imported is that it is seen as a subcategory of capitalism, and capitalism is ultimately corrupt and godless and has no center, has no moral center. So we just saw democracy as capitalism as sort of winner take all stakes, self-aggrandizement. And I heard that from other people talking about people who've been elected to the legislature and things like that. Well, they're just, including my friend and former research assistant, one of his female cousins was elected to the national legislature. I said, well, this is cool. You know, how's she doing? What's she doing? And he said, oh, she's just in it for herself like all the others. You know, I was hugely skeptical of what democratization was really doing and who was benefiting. These are educated people. These are urbanites. It's not rural peasants who've been ill-served by the central government all these years. But so, you know, why are they a place where empires go to die? Maybe empires have a death wish. You know, I mean, we decide we're going to democratize. How many places have we tried to democratize now with such stunning results? I'm not being very, very careful, am I? Anyway, other things, other rants that you might want me to start on?
There's a question in the chat from Jan about the work you're doing with the two families.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there is this thing, both of these families, in the one case, Ahmed Saeed, whose story I told you, was well on his way to qualifying for a special immigrant visa, which is the type of visa that people who are involved in combat, also the translators, especially people who are directly involved with the military, were directly eligible. There was what's called priority 2 for special visas as well. And those were people who were at risk because of civil society work that they had done with our support. So it had to have American money in it, but the young woman who was doing the work on women at risk or on behalf of women at risk, which took her all over several provinces to interview women in jail and figure out if they're actually getting the services. So she was in a second tier of vulnerability, and the notion is that she unmarried, and her two unmarried sisters, and her mother and father, who would be put in this impossible position by having unmarried daughters. I should say that Amina, my research assistant, is also retired and in frail health. So Fardana, the girl who had this job for the last 4 years and another similar job for 2 or 3 years before that, was a primary income generator for that family. And so what I'm trying to do is through what's called the Humanitarian Parole system, which is this application that people can make when they don't have a visa and they can't readily apply for a visa because the embassy's closed and there's no way to process their application, can apply for humanitarian parole. And that application can be done by somebody who's going to sponsor them in the United States. And I can elicit their information and their personal stories, which is something I do anyway, and file it all on their behalf together with my own sponsorship, because the humanitarian parole system doesn't provide any refugee services. And it gives you a year usually in the United States to work on getting refugee status, asylum, or possibly the special immigrant visa status. So I'm trying to get these 9 people out on humanitarian parole, but there's a huge queue, and I've found, God knows how you as an Afghan are supposed to fill this form out. I had to get legal help just to understand how to do the form, because it is absolutely opaque. And once you've worked on it directly with somebody who's worked the territory, it becomes easier. But I was lucky to have friends from Ohio State who've done some work with other refugees, who guided me to a lawyer, who in turn guided me to an organization in LA that is taking people's nomination profiles for people who need humanitarian parole or refugee status, and assigning them to lawyers who will work pro bono on these cases. And I was referred to a woman who's been extremely helpful. It's actually based in Issaquah, and she's doing some of her own humanitarian parole applications. So, just by threading through a tenuous network, getting help that I did when I first saw this form, I thought, I don't know how the hell I'm going to do this. I literally don't know how to make a credible file. And with their help, with the help of a couple of attorneys and with the cooperation of the 9 people who are involved, well, the 3 or 4 who can actually, create their own statements, and the other 4 or 5 who are kids or wives with no education in one case, 2 cases, putting files together. You have to put an individual file together for each individual with an individual narrative about their risk. And it's just, it seems insurmountable. And there are, as I said, tens of thousands of these humanitarian parole applications now going through for Afghans who were not evacuated in a timely way. So that I'm working on that. There's also, apparently there's drafted legislation going through Congress that would get refugee services made available to humanitarian parole recipients, because right now humanitarian parole gets you nothing. You have to have a financial sponsor, or you won't. In fact, even to file the form is a $575 fee. And if you ask for a fee waiver, A, it'll take them months to figure out whether they're going to give you one. And B, if you don't have a financial sponsor, why would you be able to come here? It's not viable. So there's a nice capitalist catch-22 on this stuff. I'm sure it won't surprise my Afghan friends. And I have told them that I would sponsor them for a year, which is going to change my retirement profile, but it seems like that's the thing to do.
There's another question in the chat from Frank McCormick about your archaeological experience.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Yep. Sorry, there's another question in chat from Frank asking about your archaeological experience and if you can give some ancient Afghan context.
Well, the archaeology I did, I was a naive BA recipient trying to decide what to do as a graduate career, and it was going to be somewhere between folklore and archaeology based on my previous undergraduate experience. And I had thought if I did archaeology, I'd do West Coast America because I'd like to come home. But the first dig I could talk my way onto as an inexperienced undergraduate, which is not how you get on a dig, was in Iran, southern Iran. And so I went there, no language, get an airplane. And in fact, I think when I saw the ad on the bulletin board at school for possible volunteers, I wasn't sure whether it was Iran or Iraq, but it was Iran. And to make a fairly, I don't know whether to tell this story or not, but it turned out that the site, the primary archaeologist was largely a figment of his own imagination. I guess I can't say it was a fraudulent project because I think he believed what was going on, but he was such a pretentious idiot that when he went to Iran looking, he had gotten some support, and I'm not sure in what order he got this support, but he got some support from Aramco, which is the Arab American Petroleum Consortium at that point. And a lot of the guys who did, Western guys who did petroleum survey work were doing it from the air, and they would see sites, they would see archaeological sites which were visible from the air, and they were kind of amateur archaeologists, and these are guys who are interested in dirt anyway. And so this individual, who probably should be named, but I won't, got a small grant that was supposed to be for an incipient year. And what he proposed was he was going to find the type site that linked the Mesopotamian Valley with the Indus Valley. I mean, think about it.
The what site?
Indus is in
India.
where?
Yeah.
Get out your maps, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, it was absurd and it was totally pretentious. And apparently he announced that he was going to do this. It's like, you know, finding the holy grail of archaeology, whatever. And he had some field experience in Israel, he was not Israeli, he was American. So he wasn't, you know, technically he was an archaeologist and trained, but he was also, like I said, a figment of his own imagination. And he went to Shiraz in southern Iran, which was adjacent to to Takht Jamshid, Persepolis, this enormous site that had been destroyed by Alexander. It was the imperial site of pre-Islamic Iran. Anyway, Persepolis is an incredible archaeological site, and near Persepolis is a little town occupied by professional Iranian archaeologists, guys who were techies. And the head of these techies was a guy who'd been in the business for 50 years, actually. He'd started when he was 12 years old. And the American, who shall not be named, hired him to help go look for a type site, you know, a place to dig. And he decided, since this was somehow near enough to Iran, to the Mesopotamian Valley, and somehow would hook up with trade routes from the Indus Valley. Okay. Well, apparently he explained this to the head techie, and the head techie went down to the bazaar in Shiraz and got a few appropriate artifacts off the bazaar, you know, surface, whatever. Put them in his pocket. They went out with their Land Rover and they drove around. And they drove up on top of a tepe, which is a elevated site where there has been a village settlement of some kind that has caused it to be elevated a little bit, and drove up on top of the site and sort of were walking around looking for surface debris to tell them what period it might be. And Ali, the head techie, picked up, you know, dropped and then picked up some appropriate artifacts and said, "Is this what you're looking for?" So he had basically salted the site for this guy. Why? Because first of all, he was an idiot. And second, and Iranians were very good at detecting idiots. They had great shit detectors, and they still do. Anyway, so this was a site that was conveniently close to all of his buddies, the techies, in their little village of techies, so that they could work close to home and go see their kid and whatever. And he had this little pot of money. So that was the site that I ended up on as a totally naive potential archaeology student with no local culture. I read my first book about Iran on the plane and figured I would pick it up from there. But that's when I decided, working with an Iranian crew in this site and not able to communicate because I didn't have any Persian at that point, but there was another very knowledgeable individual who was involved, who was actually a missionary of sorts, but he was not proselytizing. He was there because he loved Middle Eastern archaeology and was very knowledgeable and was a guide of sorts, and not to be confused with the person who was running the dig. So I decided, I don't like the politics of archaeology very much because it's so easy to be hornswoggled and, you know, and waste people's time and waste the credibility and time of the Iranians in a serious way. It was really ugly. And I'd rather, you know, do my own screwing up. And I really was more interested in the live Iranians around me. And then when I started teaching school, which I did after the dig closed, just teaching 9th grade English and creative writing, which I was completely ill-equipped to teach in Tehran at a missionary school, had ex-missionary school, it was English language school, and started learning Persian and got a little deeper in. I realized I didn't want to be in Iran because it was already colonized and not happily so. And when I got to Afghanistan, it was on New Year's vacation, which is in the spring. The spring equinox is the new year for much of Central Asia. And so I got there and found myself in this lovely little quiet Central Asian town without a whole lot of foreigners and with no evident burnout from having foreigners around. I was learning, by then I'd learned some rudimentary Persian, so I could at least, make a sentence. And I kind of fell in love with Herat, but I did not fall in love with archaeology, and what I know about Afghan archaeology, which is very, very, what can I say? It's extremely important archaeologically and extremely perilous now because the Taliban see this as false knowledge. One of the major sites right now is apparently over an enormous copper deposit, and the proposal is for a huge pit mine, of course. And one of the reasons the site is there is because historically it has been a site for copper for a long time, as in Bronze Age. And so the archaeology of Afghanistan is extremely important and extremely fraught, and I don't do it. I'm not an archaeologist. I suppose because I got burned as a very young student, but also I really liked live people, and I still do.
Margaret, I have a question for you. You talked about all the women basically of childbearing age having to be married. And I wonder if the women there practice any kind of birth control in any kind of secret way.
Oh boy. I don't know folk birth control practices, except that people feel very fortunate if they can lactate for a couple of years because they know that that space is pregnancy. That if they can keep nursing, they will not probably get pregnant, although that doesn't always work, as you know. Pills, the average village pharmacy, if there is one, or small town pharmacy, the products available come and go. So whether you can get more than a month's supply at any given time and whether it's the same pill and so on is very haphazard. Condoms are regarded as a joke, as in why are you wearing a raincoat in the shower? That's the joke. That was a joke, y'all. Anyway, yeah, I have to confess ignorance, Carol. People didn't seek to limit pregnancies when I was there, which was in the 70s, because infant mortality was pretty high and you want kids to survive. And one of the reasons my research assistant had 6 daughters is because he was trying to have 2 sons, which they ultimately succeeded in doing, one at the beginning and one at the end. But nutrition and other things can influence fertility as well. So, and just the birth difficulties, they're still very high, perinatal illness and death. And one thing that refugeedom did in both Pakistan and Iran during the Soviet period was increase the life chances of women, of birthing women and their children. So, it's kind of, I think people would like to space their children if they know that they're going to survive. And now, with the morbidity and mortality patterns that are emerging with the latest drought and famine, which it is, how does that affect people's desire to limit their birthing? It's really.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's tragic. I was thinking more in terms of having any kind of control over their lives, whereas the men, I assume, just want to increase the population. But we can move on to another question.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think I'd like to try to find some women's sources for you, because I'm speaking as a rural woman, basically, with great worries about not how to space her children, except to make sure that they are properly nourished, and that she can't guarantee that they'll have any kind of health care. Weaning itself is very dangerous because it's nutritionally taxing on the child and so on. So that kind of stuff, I think that kind of early childhood issue is more on people's minds. Perhaps, it's not clear that obviously spacing your pregnancies will help with survival of individual children, but the spacing seems like it's not, for a lot of rural women especially, it's not really in their control, for good or bad.
You mentioned the evacuation not going well at all. What did the U.S. do badly?
Well, what they did was to think it was going to take an extra 6 months for the Taliban to take Kabul. And they were just going to continue to kind of work through this huge backlog of people. How they were going to, whether that was ever realistic, even if they had until January, is a question. But that's what they say, is that we had no idea that we would lose capacity as quickly. And so the evacuation they did was heroic, but it was also, it was a matter of badly misjudged timing. But, Afghans also said we didn't expect these guys to get Kabul in, a month instead of 6 months. The odds were that the Afghan government would fold, but it would take a while to do that. So, what they did in the time they had was heroic, but also seen as yet another failure by the many people who needed it.
Margaret, do you see Frank's question about the temple to the goddess Margaret?
I'm sorry, your sound breaks up. Try that.
Yeah,
again.
I think it's this mask. It helps. Do you see Frank's comment about the temple to the goddess Margaret?
No, I didn't know there was a goddess Margaret. I missed on that. I would have done a little pilgrimage had I known.
He's asking if there was a Greek mystery cult on Cyprus or elsewhere with a temple to the goddess Margaret.
I have no clue. Never been to Cyprus. I'd love to do that, but I have no idea. I don't think I was named after her. I think I was named after my mom's English teacher.
Do we have any other questions? Any here in the room?
Well, I hope I haven't worn you all out.
That's fascinating.
No, thank you very much for your talk.
Yes.
I'm sorry, who am I talking to?
Oh, this is Jens Kruse.
Oh, hi.
Just wanted to say that I enjoyed your talk and very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, Jennifer.
Yes, thank you, Margaret. I think if we were all in front of a fireplace or at a bar, we'd be talking for many more hours.
Yeah, and I've got lots of stories. I mean, folktales galore, but nothing about the goddess Margaret, I'm afraid, in Cyprus.
Well, it's been a sobering presentation.
Yeah, it's a sobering place. I love it. I still love it, even though it's almost unrecognizable. I mean, that goes back to the whole question of endurance. What is endurance in change and the level of change that all these people have confronted?
All right, then, well, Margaret, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's all. I just, that question for me is just hugely provocative. What are we, how do you endure? How much do you lose? How much do you give to change? The Taliban, of course, feel that they are the enduring Afghan cultural presence, and that's highly debatable, but depends who's doing the debating. So, yeah, I mean, I think Carol, when you suggested the topic of endurance as a overall, overarching topic for this, I thought, yeah. And then as I thought about it, we think of endurance as persistence in a set of, kind of set goals and set accomplishments. And that just this situation so defies drawing a single historical line. It's really hard to say, except endurance, I think, I don't know, to put it very simply, I think endurance for a lot of Afghans is living long enough to raise your kids and see them raising their kids. You know, that they just want a peaceful life for themselves and for their children, and they really do, and that's the majority. But how you achieve that, how you achieve a moral environment in which to raise people who won't prey on one another is a hugely consequential Afghan question at this point.
That actually reminds me, if I may, Carol organized a little while ago an author talk by Karl Marlantes about his novel Deep River.
I don't know that. Oh,
which I unfortunately couldn't attend, but I have since read the novel, and it's about a Finnish family, their beginnings in Finland, and of course Finland is a country that has endured. It was first ruled by the Swedes, and then by the Russians, and then invaded by the Soviets, and so this Finnish family, you know, one by one emigrates to the United States and makes their lives logging in the Pacific Northwest. And it turns out that in the novel that the Finns have a concept that's called sisu. And what it means is sort of endurance. It's like courage over time, persistence.
yeah.
And so anyway, your talk, you know, reminded me of reading that novel, and I recommend it highly to anyone. It's not the greatest prose, but it's quite a story. So anyway, sisu.
Yeah, we could go on about Finland. Finland is full of interesting folklorists and other things. I've been there, and have some colleagues there and so on, but that's another conversation.
Right.
Well, Margaret, thank you so much for your time and for your knowledge and insight. And I know I'll be thinking a lot about this over the coming weeks. And if there's something that you would recommend to us that we could do to help the people in Afghanistan, I'd love
simply, I mean, there's a lot of help flowing around. I personally think that the Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services, LIRS, and you can Google them readily, what they're primarily doing is setting up support for Afghans who've gotten here. So they're working with people that the State Department has already, you know, punched a card for. But I think they're very professional, and they've been doing it for a long time. So and they are cooperating with the Northwest Refugee, what's it called? I don't know, operating out of Tacoma, I think, north of northwestern Washington, actually. So they are doing some settlement work here. So I mean, there's many organizations, but that's one that I think looks good, looks real.
Margaret, if you succeed in bringing any of your families here, I would expect that there are a whole lot of us on the island who'd like to help, and that there are helping organizations on the island that if you haven't already thought of reaching out to them, probably would be a good idea.
Well, yeah, I actually have thought about that a lot. The one family, my research assistant, two of his daughters are in California, or three by now, and his brother is there also, but not in a position to help financially. But they are there, so they have a personal network, and that really counts for a lot. So I'm sure they'll be heading there if we manage to get them in. But the problem here, as you well know, and I should say I'm active in Opal as well, is that there's no place for working people to live that's affordable. People with entry-level jobs, you can't live on a single entry-level salary as a family in San Juan County, basically. And there's physically no affordable housing to be had. I mean, if you look at what Opal has tried to do, to put in a plug for Opal, which has nothing to do with Afghans, and God love them, they don't need to. For April's Grove, which had 44 affordable apartments from studio up to, 3-bedroom, mostly studio and single bed. We had 200 applicants for 44 places, applicant families qualified. So, would I invite a family here to work and live? No, I can't. because of the discrepancy between earned income and cost of living, which is as bad in this county as it is probably anywhere in the country. That's a whole nother talk.
Mhm.
Yes, the one that's close to home. Well,
Yeah.
thank you again, Margaret.
Bless you, Margaret.
You're
Thank you.
welcome, Carol. Thanks for organizing.
Hey, you bet. And thanks to everyone for your patience with the technology. I'm still finding my way, and this was yet another permutation that we hadn't done before where the host or the presenter is not here. So thanks
I want
again.
to say that we can blame NOAA for that, because I looked up the weather and it was supposed to be blowing 20 to 30 knots and there's no wind at all.
All right, well, stay safe and warm, and thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Very much.
زمانه است که هر کس با خود گرفتار است عالم گرفتاری خوش تسلسل دارد گرفتاری خوش